The medical bay of the Fleet Command carrier Aegis smelled of sterility and boredom. A low, constant hum from the life support systems was the only sound, a metallic lullaby for the half-dozen personnel waiting in their paper-thin gowns. Master-at-Arms Ilara Vance sat on the edge of a diagnostic bed, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on her knees. She watched the rhythmic pulse of light on a vital signs monitor across the room, her expression as neutral as the polished white walls. She was a recent transfer, another name on a long manifest, assigned to the ship's security detail from a supposedly quiet logistics hub on Triton. Her file was lean, almost suspiciously so. Exemplary marks in basic compliance, 0 commendations, 0 demerits. A ghost in the machine. A young medic, Petty Officer Chen, approached with a data slate, his movements brisk and efficient but tinged with the weary repetition of his duties. "Vance, Ilara, correct?" he asked, not quite making eye contact. "Correct," she replied. Her voice was low even, betraying no hint of impatience. "Standard readiness physical. We'll run the bioscans, check for microfractures, neural degradation, the usual. Please remove your tunic." He gestured vaguely toward the scanner, a large, intimidating arch of chrome and sensors. Vance nodded once and began to unfasten the high collar of her gray shipboard uniform. The fabric rustled in the quiet room. Just as she was about to pull the tunic over her head, the bay doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss that cut through the low hum. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The bored slump of shoulders straightened into rigid attention. The casual chatter between two nurses ceased mid-word. Admiral Thorne strode into the medical bay, flanked by 2 stern-faced aides. His uniform was a masterpiece of tailored precision, dark blue fabric adorned with ribbons that told stories of campaigns Vance had only read about in sanitized historical briefs. His face was sharp, etched with the certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed. He was conducting a surprise inspection of the ship's core facilities, and his presence here was like a hawk descending into a chicken coop. The chief medical officer, Commander Aris, hurried to meet him, his face a mask of flustered professionalism. "Admiral Thorne, an unexpected honor. Is everything to your satisfaction?" Thorne's eyes, the color of chipped slate, swept across the room, missing nothing. They catalogued the state of the equipment, the posture of the staff, the cowed expressions of the waiting personnel. His gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. It was a look that judged and found wanting. He barely acknowledged Eris, instead picking up a data slate from a nearby console. He scrolled through the duty roster, his thumb moving with dismissive speed. "Readiness levels are at 94%, Admiral," Eris offered, trying to fill the silence, well within operational parameters. Thorne stopped scrolling. His eyes landed on a name. "Vance, Ilara, Master-at-Arms. Transfer from the Triton Depot." He looked up, his gaze scanning the line of waiting crew until it settled on her. He didn't speak to her, but about her, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Triton? Isn't that where we send personnel to count shipping containers until they retire?" "Standards are slipping, Commander, if this is the caliber of security we're assigning to the flagship." The insult was casual, delivered with the thoughtless cruelty of absolute authority. Chen flinched slightly. Vance's expression did not change. She simply met the Admiral's gaze, her own eyes dark and unreadable. She had heard variations of that sentiment her entire career. She was a name on a list, a statistic in a readiness report, a warm body to fill a slot. "She meets the physical requirements, Admiral," Aris said, his voice tight. "The requirements are the bare minimum," Thorne countered. tossing the slate back onto the console with a clatter. "The bare minimum does not win wars. Proceed, petty officer." He gestured toward Chen, a silent command to continue his work. Thorne did not leave. He stood with his arms crossed, a silent, intimidating observer of the mundane. He wanted to see for himself what passed for a fleet-ready soldier these days. The pressure in the room was immense. Chen swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now a strained whisper, "your tunic." With the Admiral's cold eyes fixed on her, Vance finally pulled the gray tunic over her head. She folded it neatly and placed it on the edge of the bed. And then she turned to face the scanner. For a full second, there was only the hum of the ship. Then a sharp intake of breath from Chen. Commander Eris's professional mask crumbled into slack-jawed shock. One of the aides behind the Admiral let out a soft, involuntary gasp. Thorne went rigid. The casual arrogance fell away from him like a dropped cloak, replaced by an unnerving, predatory stillness. He took a step forward, then another, his eyes locked on Vance's back. Her skin was a roadmap of violence. From her shoulders down to her waist, a tapestry of scars was woven into her flesh. They were not the clean, thin lines of a surgeon's blade. These were jagged, puckered, and brutal. A starburst pattern of melted flesh bloomed over her left shoulder blade, the telltale sign of a plasma scorch at close range. A series of deep, parallel gouges ran diagonally across her spine, as if she had been clawed by some massive, metallic beast. But it was the other marks that held the Admiral's attention, the ones that made his blood run cold. Small, precise, geometric tattoos were nestled among the chaos of healed wounds. A black diamond on the nape of her neck. A barely visible tracery of a coiled serpent just below her right ear. A series of 3 small dots, arranged in a triangle on her wrist. They were not decorative. They were markers, unit designations from operations that didn't officially exist. Ghosts whispered about in training simulators and hushed bar conversations. Black Ops units so secret their members were scrubbed from every official record upon entry. Thorne's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, dangerous thing, stripped of all its earlier condescension. "Where?" he began, stepping closer until he was standing directly behind her. "Did you get these?" He wasn't asking about the battle wounds. He was asking about the symbols. His tone was not one of curiosity. It was an accusation, an interrogation. He thought she was a fraud, someone who had marked herself to imitate legends. Vance didn't turn around. She simply stood there, her scarred back a testament to a life he couldn't possibly comprehend from her sterile file. "Places the fleet doesn't go, Admiral," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. The Admiral's jaw tightened. The implication was an insult to his authority, to the very institution he represented. "Those are restricted unit signifiers. Forgery is a court-martial offense, Master-at-Arms. I have sent men to the stockade for less." The pressure he exerted was no longer just his presence. It was a focused, palpable threat. He was challenging her, daring her to break. He saw a clerk from a logistics depot playing soldier, and it offended him on a fundamental level. "I am aware," Vance replied, her tone flat. Before Thorne could press his interrogation further, the universe tore itself apart. It began not with a bang, but with a sickening lurch. The deck plates of the Aegis groaned, a deep, resonant sound of metal being stressed beyond its limits. The sterile white lights of the medical bay flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into the terrifying red glow of emergency strobes. A high-pitched, wailing alarm klaxoned through the ship, a sound designed to inspire panic. Then came the impact. A concussive wave slammed through the hull. It wasn't the clean, distant explosion of ship-to-ship combat. It was the brutal, intimate violence of a direct hit. The entire bay convulsed. Diagnostic machines tore free from their moorings and became deadly projectiles. The arching scanner Vance was about to step into collapsed with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. Petty Officer Chen was thrown against a supply cabinet, his head striking the edge with a sickening crack. Admiral Thorne, for all his authority, was just a man made of flesh and bone. He was flung sideways, his immaculate uniform no defense against the raw physics of the impact. He hit the deck hard, his head connecting with the base of a diagnostic bed. He grunted, dazed, a trickle of blood running from his temple. The two aides who had been his silent shadows were gone, one thrown through the shattered viewport into the cold vacuum of space, the other buried under a pile of sparking debris. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screaming alarms, hissing pipes, and the terrified shouts of the wounded. The main blast door to the corridor buckled inward, its frame glowing cherry red before being sealed shut by the ship's emergency protocols. They were trapped. For a few precious seconds, chaos reigned. Commander Eris, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, stumbled around in the crimson gloom, shouting orders that no one could hear over the din. The other patients were either unconscious or screaming, their minor ailments forgotten in the face of immediate, violent death. The Admiral, the pinnacle of the command structure, pushed himself onto one elbow, his eyes glazed with pain and confusion. His authority, his entire worldview, had been shattered in an instant. The order he cherished was gone, replaced by a primal fight for survival. And in the center of it all, Elara Vance stood like a rock in a raging river. The blast had thrown her forward, but she had twisted in midair, absorbing the impact with a fluid roll that spoke of thousands of hours of training. She came up on one knee, her body a coiled spring of potential energy. The flashing red lights cast shifting demonic shadows across her scarred back. Her face, which had been a mask of calm neutrality, was now transformed. The placid surface was gone, burned away to reveal something hard and ancient beneath. Her eyes, dark and focused, swept the room, not in panic but in assessment. She was not seeing a medical bay in ruins. She was seeing a tactical environment, cover, concealment, threats, assets. Her movements became a blur of brutal efficiency. She ignored the screaming, the alarms, the fires starting to lick at exposed power conduits. Triage, that came first. She lunged toward Chen, who was slumped against the cabinet, unconscious and bleeding. Her fingers went to his neck, checking for a pulse. Strong, but thready. She ripped a strip of fabric from a nearby bedsheet, expertly wrapping it around the gash on his head, applying direct pressure. It wasn't gentle, it was functional. He was an asset, a medic. She needed him. Next, the Admiral. He was trying to get to his feet, a hand pressed to his bleeding temple, his face pale with shock. "Report," he croaked, his voice thin and reedy. "What's the status?" He was trying to reclaim control, to impose order on a situation that no longer recognized his rank. Vance was already moving past him. "Status is we're alive, and the rest of the ship isn't answering," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, utterly devoid of deference. She grabbed a small, sturdy metal tray from a cart, her eyes scanning the buckled blast door. "That door is compromised. They'll either cut through it or blow it." "They?" Thorne demanded, staggering to his feet. "Who are they?" "Whoever shot a torpedo into a fleet carrier's medical bay," she shot back, not even looking at him. "Assume borders. Assume they're hostile and organized." She moved to the main power conduit, which was sparking violently. A fire there would consume their remaining oxygen in minutes. She grabbed a CO2 extinguisher from the wall, slammed the base of it against the damaged panel to break the locking mechanism, and blanketed the electrical fire in a cloud of frigid white gas. The crackling stopped. One threat neutralized. Commander Eris was fumbling with a comms panel, his hands shaking. "The comms are dead. I can't get a signal to the bridge, or anywhere." "Stop," Vance commanded. The single word cut through Eris's panic like a razor. He froze, turning to look at her. In the strobing red light, she looked like a vision from a nightmare, her face set in a grim mask of concentration. Broadcasting on an open channel during a potential boarding action is suicide. You'll just give them our position. She surveyed the survivors. 2 other patients were dead. A third was alive but trapped under a heavy piece of machinery, his leg clearly crushed. Vance gave him a quick, professional glance. The injury was too severe, the resources too limited. She made a decision in a fraction of a second that would have taken a committee weeks to debate. She moved on. A brutal calculus, but a necessary one. The Admiral watched her, his head throbbing. He saw the way she moved, the economy of her motion, the way her eyes never stopped scanning, cataloging, prioritizing. This was not a master-at-arms from a logistics depot. This was something else entirely. The condescension he had felt minutes ago was being rapidly replaced by a bewildering sense of dislocation. The world was no longer functioning according to the rules he understood. Rank, protocol, procedure, they had all been vaporized in the attack. All that was left was competence, and this woman radiated it from every pore. A loud metallic screech echoed from the other side of the blast door. The sound of a plasma cutter. "They're through in 90 seconds, Vance stated, her voice a low growl. She looked around the wrecked bay, her mind working, processing options at an incredible speed. Her gaze fell on a high-pressure line for dispensing medical gases, oxygen, nitrogen. It was ruptured, hissing faintly. An idea, desperate and lethal, formed in her mind. She grabbed a length of sturdy cable from the floor, once used to secure a diagnostic imager. She stripped one end with a shard of broken glass, exposing the wires. Then she turned to Aris. "Commander, I need every flammable anesthetic and sterilizing agent you have. Now." Aris, his panic giving way to the sheer force of her will, simply nodded and scrambled toward a locked medical cabinet. Thorne finally found his voice again, a flicker of his old authority returning. "What is your plan, Master-at-Arms?" Vance didn't pause in her work. "The plan is to not die in this room," she said, her hands moving with practiced speed as she began to rig a makeshift device. "There are 2 kinds of people in a crisis, Admiral. Those who make a plan, and those who get in the way of the plan. Decide which one you are." The Admiral stared at her, the blood from his temple forgotten. The woman he had dismissed as a paper pusher was now building a bomb in the ruins of his flagship, and she had just issued him an ultimatum. For the first time in 20 years, Kaelin Thorne was not the one in command. The screeching of the plasma cutter grew louder, a harbinger of the violence that was about to pour through the door, and his survival, he was beginning to realize, depended entirely on the scarred, silent woman from Triton. The plasma cutter sliced through the last section of the blast door with a final, piercing shriek. A perfect circle of molten metal, glowing an angry orange, fell inward onto the deck with a heavy clang, sending up a shower of sparks. Silence descended for a heartbeat, thick and pregnant with violence. Then, the barrel of a pulse rifle poked through the opening, followed by a helmeted head. 2 boarders, clad in matte black armor devoid of any insignia, dropped silently into the room. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of professionals. Their weapons swept the bay, seeking targets. They saw the dazed admiral, the terrified doctor, the unconscious medic. Easy prey. What they didn't see was Alara Vance. She had positioned herself in the darkest corner of the room, flattened against the wall behind the wreckage of the scanner, using the deep shadows cast by the emergency strobes as her camouflage. The moment the first boarder's boots hit the deck, she moved. She didn't run, she flowed. A silent, gray wraith detaching from the darkness. Before the second boarder was even halfway through the opening, she was on the first. She didn't have a weapon, so she became one. Her left hand shot out, not to strike, but to hook the barrel of his rifle, yanking it downward and aside. Simultaneously, her right elbow drove upward in a vicious, short arc blow that connected with the underside of his jaw. The crack of vertebrae was sickeningly loud in the enclosed space. The soldier dropped without a sound, his nervous system severed. The second boarder reacted instantly, spinning to bring his weapon to bear. He was fast, but Vance was faster. She was already inside his guard, using the body of his fallen comrade as a shield. She kicked the dead soldier's legs out, sending the corpse sliding into the second boarder, momentarily breaking his stance. In that split second of imbalance, Vance lunged. She grabbed his rifle with both hands, twisting it with ferocious strength. The weapon was wrenched from his grasp. She didn't try to shoot him with it, too slow. Instead, she reversed her grip and used the rifle's stock as a bludgeon, slamming it into the side of his helmet. The composite material cracked. The man staggered back, stunned. Vance didn't give him time to recover. She dropped the rifle and drove the heel of her palm up under his chin, snapping his head back. Her other hand darted to his belt, unclipped a combat knife, and in one smooth, continuous motion, drove it up under his armpit, through the weaker armor joint, and deep into his chest. He shuddered once and collapsed on top of his partner. The entire engagement had taken less than 5 seconds. It was a whirlwind of precise, economical violence, utterly devoid of wasted motion. Admiral Thorne watched, frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He had seen combat footage, he had seen training simulations. He had never seen anything like this. This was not a soldier fighting, this was a predator hunting. The techniques she used, the specific nerve strike, the weapon disarm, the brutal efficiency of the kill, were not standard fleet doctrine. They belonged to a darker, more specialized world. Vance didn't pause to admire her work. She immediately stripped the dead soldiers of their rifles, ammunition packs, and a small demolition charge. She tossed 1 rifle and 2 energy packs to the Admiral. The weapon felt alien and heavy in his hands. "Can you use this?" she asked, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Thorne, shaken from his stupor, gave a curt nod. "I can." "Good. Watch the door. Shoot anything that isn't us." She moved back to the device she had been building. The makeshift bomb was a grotesque assembly of IV bags filled with flammable anesthetic, taped to a pressurized oxygen canister. The cable she had stripped was wired to the detonator she had taken from the boarder's demolition charge. "Eris," she snapped, and the commander, who had been hiding behind a console, peeked out, his face ashen. "That leaking gas line, is it flammable?" "It's a nitrogen coolant line," he stammered. "Not flammable, but if it mixes with the oxygen from that tank under pressure, it becomes a thermobaric explosive," Vance finished for him, her eyes gleaming with grim satisfaction in the red light. "Get back." More shouts echoed from the corridor outside. The first 2 boarders hadn't reported back. A new sound started, the heavy rhythmic thud of a breaching ram against the weakened doorframe. They were coming in force. Vance dragged the 2 corpses over to the ruptured coolant line, positioning them to obscure her device. She armed the detonator, its small green light blinking like a malevolent eye in the darkness. She backed away, taking cover behind the same overturned diagnostic bed as the Admiral. "On my signal, you opened fire," she whispered, her breath warm against the cold air. "Don't aim to kill, aim to suppress. Keep their heads down, make them advance into the room." Thorne gripped the unfamiliar rifle, the cold metal a stark reality against his skin. His heart was pounding, a frantic drum against his ribs. He was an admiral. He commanded fleets from the sterile safety of a bridge. He hadn't held a rifle in a combat situation in 30 years. Yet he found himself instinctively deferring to the quiet master-at-arms. Her certainty was an anchor in the swirling chaos. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. The doorframe gave way with a deafening crash. A half-dozen more black-clad soldiers stormed in, fanning out, their weapons spitting coherent light. Laser bolts sizzled through the air, gouging molten holes in the walls and equipment. "Now!" Vance hissed. Thorne rose from cover and fired. His first shots were wild, but he quickly found his rhythm, laying down a pattern of suppressive fire as he had been taught in the academy decades ago. The bolts hammered against the boarder's cover, forcing them to duck and return fire. As planned, 2 of them broke from cover, advancing into the room to flank their position. They moved past the pile of their fallen comrades, their boots splashing in the slick of leaking coolant. Vance's thumb hovered over the detonator. She watched their advance, her patience absolute, her timing perfect. She waited until they were right on top of the trap. "Admiral," she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, "get down." He obeyed without hesitation. She pressed the button. The detonator sent an electric charge into the oxygen canister. It ruptured, releasing its contents in a violent, instantaneous cloud. The pure oxygen mixed with the aerosolized anesthetic and the nitrogen coolant, creating a highly volatile cocktail. The spark from the exposed wires ignited it. The result was not a simple explosion. It was a fuel-air detonation. The air itself caught fire. A wave of white-hot pressure erupted from the center of the room, expanding in a silent, ravenous sphere. For a split second, the bay was illuminated with the light of a miniature sun. The 2 advancing boarders were instantly incinerated, their armor vaporized. The others near the doorway were thrown back into the corridor like broken dolls, their bodies flash-cooked inside their suits. The wave of overpressure slammed into Vance and Thorne, even behind cover. It felt like being hit by a solid wall, stealing the breath from their lungs. Then came the vacuum as the air rushed back in. The heat was immense, searing their exposed skin. When the Admiral dared to look up, the scene was one of utter devastation. The center of the room was a blackened, melted crater. What was left of the boarders was little more than carbonized shadows on the walls. The fire had consumed all the oxygen, and was now starving itself out, leaving behind a thick, acrid smoke. In the ringing silence that followed, Thorne looked at Vance. She was already on her feet, the rifle held at the ready, her eyes scanning the smoldering doorway for any new threats. A thin trickle of blood ran from her nose, a result of the barotrauma, but otherwise she seemed completely unfazed. He pushed himself up, his body aching, his ears ringing. He looked at the carnage she had wrought with medical supplies and scrap. He looked at her standing amidst the destruction she had created, a calm, lethal guardian. And in that moment a fragment of a memory, long buried, surfaced in his mind. He remembered a briefing years ago, a top-secret, eyes-only report on Operation Cinderfall, a disastrous campaign in the Outer Rim against a non-human species known as the Scourge. The official history said the fleet was ambushed and annihilated, but the whispers, the classified after-action reports he was never supposed to see, told a different story. They spoke of a single, small unit of operatives inserted behind enemy lines, a ghost unit. They were tasked with assassinating the Scourge Hive Queen, a suicide mission deep within enemy territory. The official record stated the unit, designated Task Force Nix, was lost with all hands. But the legend said one of them had made it out. One survivor who had single-handedly fought their way through 10 miles of hostile territory after the mission was complete, carrying vital intelligence that turned the tide of the war in that sector. The reports were sealed, the unit's existence denied. Its members declared dead to protect their identities. The survivor's call sign was never officially recorded, but the grunts who passed the story around had a name for her. They called her the Ghost of Cinderfall. Thorne looked at the black diamond tattooed on the nape of Vance's neck, barely visible above the collar of her borrowed combat vest. It wasn't just a unit marker. It was the symbol for Task Force Nix. His mind reeled. The quiet, unassuming master-at-arms from the Triton Depot. The woman he had derided for being below fleet standards. He hadn't been looking at a logistics clerk. He had been standing in the presence of a living legend, a ghost who had walked out of a story he thought was a myth. Nix, he breathed, the name a ragged whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of dawning, terrifying comprehension. Vance's head turned slightly. Her eyes met his through the swirling smoke. She didn't confirm or deny it. She simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned her attention back to the corridor. "The explosion will draw more of them," she said, her voice all business. "We need to move. Now." The shift was instantaneous and total. The mental architecture of Admiral Thorne's world, built on the rigid framework of rank, protocol, and hierarchy, collapsed. He was no longer an admiral, and she was no longer a master-at-arms. In this crucible of fire and death, those designations were meaningless. There were only two roles left, leader and follower. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, which one he was. "What's the plan?" he asked. The question was not a demand from a superior officer. It was a plea from a survivor to his savior. "The ship's primary. Command functions are down," Vance stated, checking the energy pack on her captured rifle. "Bridge is likely compromised or destroyed. Secondary command is in engineering, 3 decks down. But that will be their primary objective. They'll expect us to go there." "So, we go elsewhere?" Thorne offered, his mind starting to work along tactical lines again, albeit following her lead. "No," she countered, her eyes scanning the ceiling. "We go there, but we don't use the corridors. They'll have them locked down and swept." She pointed upward with the barrel of her rifle toward a maintenance conduit, its cover plate partially dislodged from the explosion. "We use the ship's guts." Petty Officer Chen was beginning to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. Vance was at his side in a moment. She checked his pupils with a practiced eye. "Concussion," she diagnosed. "Can you walk?" Chen nodded weakly, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain, fear, and sheer awe. He had seen what she had done. He was looking at her not as a patient, but as something mythic. "Good," Vance said. "You're our medic. Grab a full trauma kit. Eris." The commander jumped at the sound of his name. "Find a portable cutting torch. We're going to need it." As Eris scrambled to obey, Vance turned back to the Admiral. She unclipped the demolition charge she'd taken from the first boarder and held it out to him. It was a small, powerful breaching charge. "If we get pinned down, you use this on a bulkhead. Create a new door. Don't hesitate." Thorne took the device. The weight of it was immense, not in pounds, but in responsibility. She was entrusting him with a vital piece of their survival plan. It was a transfer of command more profound than any official ceremony. He was her subordinate now. His mission was to follow her orders. "Understood," he said, his voice firm. With the cutting torch, Vance quickly sliced through the damaged hinges of the maintenance hatch. It opened onto a dark, narrow crawl space filled with thick bundles of cables and pipes. It was claustrophobic, dirty, and dangerous. "I'll take point," she said. "Chen, you're in the middle. Admiral, you have our rear. Keep your eyes open. These access ways connect the entire ship. They might have the same idea." She boosted herself up into the darkness without another word. Chen, clutching his medkit, shakily followed. Thorne paused for a moment, looking back at the smoking ruin of the medical bay. His world had been orderly, predictable, governed by rules he had helped write. Now it was this: smoke, death, and a crawl through the bowels of his own ship, following a ghost he had dismissed as a clerk. He took a deep breath, the acrid air stinging his lungs, and pulled himself up into the crawlspace. The darkness swallowed him whole. The journey through the ship's service conduits was a tense, suffocating ordeal. The narrow spaces were a maze of wiring, coolant pipes, and structural supports. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Every groan of the ship's damaged frame sounded like an approaching enemy. Thorne, used to the expansive, clean corridors of his command, felt a rising sense of claustrophobia. But he crushed it down, focusing on the dark shape of Chen's boots in front of him and the absolute confidence radiating from their unseen guide. Vance moved through the labyrinth with an unnerving familiarity, as if she had memorized the ship's blueprints. She navigated by the hum of different power relays, the temperature of the pipes, the subtle vibrations in the deck. Twice she held up a hand, freezing them in place. They would listen as the heavy, rhythmic tramp of armored boots passed in the corridor directly below them. Her instincts were flawless. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped. "We're here," she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the darkness. "Directly above the auxiliary control room for engineering." She pointed to a grated panel in the floor of the conduit. "They'll have the main entrance guarded, but they won't expect an attack from the ceiling." She carefully pried up the grate. Below them lay the engineering sublevel. It was chaos. Technicians in grease-stained jumpsuits were either dead or huddled in corners, held at gunpoint by a dozen more of the black-clad boarders. The enemy was focused on the main reactor console, their leader, a hulking figure with red markings on his helmet, barking orders as they attempted to bypass the lockdown codes. They were trying to trigger a reactor meltdown, not just capture the ship but destroy it, and the rest of the fleet with it. Thorne felt a surge of cold fury. This was his ship, his crew. "We're outnumbered 4-1, he whispered, stating the obvious, the commander in him instinctively assessing the odds. "The odds are irrelevant," Vance whispered back. "The objective is the only thing that matters." She laid out the plan with chilling simplicity. The room is filled with pressurized steam conduits. A rupture will create chaos. "Chen, you have the med kit. Be ready for burns. Admiral, when I make my move, you will provide covering fire on their leader, the one with the red helmet. Do not let him interface with that console. I will handle the rest." She didn't wait for an answer. She swung herself down from the opening, landing as silently as a cat on top of a high bank of machinery. For a moment, no one saw her. She was just another shadow in a room already full of them. Then she opened fire. Her first volley wasn't aimed at a person. It was aimed at the primary valve of a massive steam pipe running along the wall. The high-caliber pulse rounds tore through the reinforced metal. With a deafening roar, a jet of superheated steam erupted into the room. instantly turning the area into a scalding white fog. The boarders cried out in surprise and pain, their visibility cut to zero. Their disciplined formation broke. "Now, Admiral." Vance's voice cut through the hiss of the steam. Thorne didn't hesitate. He leaned through the grate and fired, his shots guided by the last known position of the enemy commander. One of his bolts struck true, hitting the leader in the shoulder, spinning him away from the reactor console. Below, Vance was a specter in the mist. She used the chaos she had created perfectly. The boarders, blinded and disoriented, fired wildly into the steam. Vance moved between them, a blur of motion. A silenced pistol, procured from one of the dead soldiers, coughed twice. 2 boarders fell. A knife flashed. A third throat was opened. She was a reaper harvesting souls in a field of fog. The remaining boarders, realizing they were being slaughtered, began to fall back, regrouping near the main entrance. Vance pressed her attack, herding them, forcing them into a tight cluster. It was then that Thorne understood. She wasn't just killing them, she was positioning them. She vaulted over a console, landing in the center of the room. She drew the last of her captured weapons, a single concussion grenade. She armed it and threw it not at the enemy, but at the ceiling directly above them. The grenade detonated with a deafening boom, but its purpose wasn't shrapnel. It was pure concussive force. A large section of the ceiling, already weakened by the fighting, collapsed directly onto the clustered group of boarders, burying them under tons of metal and wiring. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of the ruptured pipe and the groans of the wounded. The Admiral lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from adrenaline. He watched as Vance walked calmly through the wreckage, putting a single, precise shot into any of the buried enemy soldiers who still showed signs of life. It wasn't cruelty. It was a final, grim necessity. He and Chen dropped down into the room. The surviving engineering crew stared at Vance with wide, terrified eyes. They had just witnessed the impossible. Thorne walked over to the main console. The enemy commander, wounded but alive, glared at him with pure hatred. Thorne ignored him and looked at the screen. The meltdown sequence was at 80%. "Vance," he said, his voice strained. "I can't abort it. They've locked me out." Vance strode to the console. She shoved the enemy leader aside and studied the alien code scrolling across the screen. Her fingers flew across the keypad, not with the clumsiness of a soldier, but with the deftness of a master slicer. Code and countercode warred on the screen. "They're using a military-grade encryption worm," she said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "But it's sloppy, arrogant." With a final series of keystrokes, she shattered their encryption. A message flashed on the screen. "Meltdown, sequence aborted, command lockdown, re-engaged." The red emergency lights throughout engineering flickered and died, replaced by the steady, calm white of standard illumination. The klaxons went silent. The hiss of the steam pipe began to subside as emergency systems kicked in to seal the rupture. The immediate crisis was over. Thorne looked from the console screen to Vance, and then to the wounded enemy commander, who was now being secured by the ship's crew. He walked over to the man and ripped the helmet from his head. He needed to see the face of the man who had almost destroyed his ship. The commander spat a mouthful of blood onto the deck. "You got lucky," he snarled. "No one could have predicted a ghost on this ship." He looked past the Admiral, his eyes locking on Vance. A look of dawning, horrified recognition crossed his face. "Cinderfall," he whispered. "I heard stories. I never believed them." The name hung in the air, confirming everything. The surviving engineers and Chen stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The scars, the fighting style, the impossible victory. They were standing next to a legend. Vance ignored them all. She picked up the rifle she had used, methodically breaking it down, checking the action for steam-induced moisture. Her focus was absolute, her movements precise. She was a warrior, and this was her ritual. Thorne walked slowly toward her, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet engineering bay. He stopped a few feet away. He did not know what to say. "Thank you" felt insultingly inadequate. An apology for his earlier dismissal felt pathetic. He was an admiral. He commanded a fleet, but in that moment he felt like a raw cadet standing before the most seasoned instructor. He said the only thing that felt right. He stood to attention, his posture as ramrod straight as it was on the day he graduated from the academy. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. It was not the salute of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a soldier, an acknowledgement of skill, courage, and sacrifice that transcended rank. One by one, the engineers, their faces smudged with grease and smoke, rose to their feet. They too saluted. Chen, his head bandaged, was the last to join, his salute trembling slightly but filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. Vance finished cleaning the rifle. She reassembled it with a series of clean, efficient clicks. Only then did she look up, her dark eyes meeting the Admiral's. She did not return the salute. That was not her world. Instead, she gave him a single, slow nod, an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It was more than enough. The silence stretched, filled with a new, profound understanding. The mockery was gone. The dismissal was a distant memory. In its place was a deep, unshakable respect, earned not with words but with blood, fire, and impossible competence. Hours later, the Aegis was limping, but she was alive. The remaining boarders had been neutralized, the ship secured. A fragile calm had settled over the crew as they began the long, arduous process of damage control. Alara Vance stood alone in a small, darkened observation lounge. The viewport before her, miraculously intact, looked out onto the star-dusted velvet of space. In the distance, the soft, ethereal glow of a nebula painted a silent, cosmic masterpiece. She was cleaning the combat knife she had taken, her movements methodical, rhythmic, a form of meditation. The blood was long gone, but the ritual remained. The door hissed open behind her. She didn't turn, but she knew who it was. The cadence of his footsteps was unmistakable. Admiral Thorne came to stand beside her, not too close, respecting her space. He didn't wear his formal jacket now. He was in his shirt sleeves, the dried blood still a dark stain on his temple. He looked out at the nebula, his reflection a tired, older man in the reinforced glass. "The fleet is moving to support us," he said, his voice quiet. "We'll make it to Starbase 12 for repairs. You saved this ship, Vance. You saved us all." Vance finished wiping the blade and slid it back into its sheath. "I followed my training, Admiral," she said. Her voice once again the quiet, unassuming tone he had first heard in the medical bay. The ghost was receding, the clerk returning. "No," Thorne said, turning to face her. "You did more than that. I read your unsealed file, the real one. Operation Cinderfall, what they left out is more terrifying than what they put in." He paused, his throat tight. "I was a young captain on the council that approved that mission. We sent you and your team to die. We wrote you all off." Vance finally turned to look at him. Her eyes held no anger, no resentment, only a profound, weary stillness, like a deep lake that has seen too many storms. "We knew the risks," she said simply. "I dismissed you," Thorne confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I looked at your file, I looked at you, and I saw a number, a cog in the machine. I was wrong." He held out a small, featureless data chip. "Your official transfer orders. I can send you anywhere you want. A quiet retirement on a paradise world. A training position at the academy. Name it. It's the least I can do." Vance looked at the chip, then back at his face. She didn't take it. "With all due respect, Admiral," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of irony in her tone. "I'm a master-at-arms. My station is here, on the flagship. Standards need to be maintained." Thorne stared at her for a long moment. Then a slow, tired smile touched his lips. He understood. She wasn't asking for a reward. She wasn't asking for recognition. She was a guardian, a protector. She would remain a ghost, hidden in plain sight, watching over them all. Her place was here, in the shadows. He pocketed the chip. "Very well, Master-at-Arms," he said, the title now imbued with a weight and respect it had never held before. "As you were." He turned and left the lounge, leaving her alone once more with the stars. Elara Vance watched him go, then turned her gaze back to the swirling colors of the nebula. The ship was safe. The crew was alive. Her watch continued. The sun of a distant, unknown star began to crest the edge of the nebula, its light spilling across the viewport, catching the faint silvery lines of the scars on her hands. They were a map of where she had been and a promise of what she would always be. Silent, watchful, ready.